Good morning and welcome back to day two. It feels like there's a little less energy in the room than yesterday. A few sore heads, no doubt, but we're going to have an absolutely fantastic day. I'd like to welcome the first panel of the day. This is an absolutely brilliant session that you're about to hear. It's being chaired by Jamie Hayward. Jamie Hayward is the CEO of Alden Scientific, and he's also a member of ICHOM's board. And the session is about how technology is creating a paradigm shift towards patient-centered and cost-effective care. So please join me in welcoming Jamie and this phenomenal panel to the stage.
Come on up. Morning, everyone. Listening yesterday, it was remarkable to hear how much progress has been made, and I think the sort of amount of energy and potential that is in the air about the ability to start actually measuring what matters and feeding it back. And this group to my left, I'll introduce in a second, is sort of remarkable in what they have done and are doing to understand the role of technology in that. And I wanted to take a second and just touch on what I think that is to set this up. So everything that we want to do, everything that we want to measure, every ability to feed back that information, to analyze it, to integrate it, is based on the ability of technology to connect it. And we are both constrained by and have potential in how we do that. And so, I think we often think of technology as sort of the last step or the thing, but I actually think it's sort of the central step. And I think that's the point of the conversation today, is that if we want any of our things to happen, it has to happen by building the highways and the systems and the interfaces and the tools that actually change the way we transact, and measure medicine itself. So let me take a second to introduce the panel. Which I've known for a number of years here. But let me start with Anish, who I worked with a long time ago when he was the first Chief Technology Officer under President Obama. I love that statement, like the first Technology Officer of the United States of America. That's a cool title. You never get that's like the George Washington of technology and government. He's the president of Care Journey now, which is an open data membership service. It's building trusted and rating systems for physicians, networks, and markets, so he's living the real world of this. He also authored Innovative State, How New Technologies Can Transform Government, and he serves on the board of the Care Cost Institute, the New Jersey Innovation Institute. There's almost nothing in improving the way technology and healthcare and government interact that Anish is not involved in. Franz Van Houten led Royal Philips from 2011 until just this month, or last month. He transformed the business into being the leading healthcare company, remains an advisor to Philips. He's a member of the supervisory board of Novartis. He serves on the steering committee of the European Roundtable for Industry. He's chairman of the supervisory board of the Emeritus Trust Foundation. He co-chairs the platform to accelerate the circular economy, co-founder of NL 2025, Social Acceleration, and co-founder of the Graduate Entrepreneur Venture Fund, involved in the World Economic Forum, literally center of business, policy, government, and the role of technology in healthcare. Peter de Bay was the managing director of the Dutch Stanton Hospital Group. He's responsible for their value-based healthcare strategy across 7 hospitals, so he's actually in the trenches doing this in one of the systems that's most advanced. The reason that it might be one of the most advanced systems is that he was, as we heard yesterday, the chief operating officer of ICHOM in the beginning, so he figured out how to do it and then went and did it. And he was a principal of BCG in the Amsterdam office of the global healthcare practice for a number of years as well. Now the one in the real hot seat here is Mickey. Mickey Tripathi is the National Coordinator of Health Information Technology, where he leads federal health IT strategy, policy, standards, and investments. So he is the one that we can blame for everything not working as it goes forward. He has the largest budget and allocation in the world to change technology in healthcare. He's well qualified. He was the Chief Alliance Officer for Arcadia, the project manager for the Argonaut Project, and industry collaboration to accelerate the adoption of FHIR. He's a board member of HL7, the Sequoia Project, the Commonwealth Health Alliance, and the Current Alliance. Karen Alliance. He was the president and CEO of the Massachusetts Health Collaborative, the founding president and CEO of the Indiana Health Information Exchange. He's a Presidential Management Fellow, and he received the Secretary of Defense Meritorious Civilian Service Award for his work at the DoD. So there is literally no group that have done no more about this. So I guess to really get into it for a second, I'd like to sort of ask this question, which is to sort of say, what drove this for you personally? And maybe a brief answer to that question. And then how do outcomes matter in where you are, and how are you changing technology and implementation? What are the barriers to that? And then we'll get into sort of a deeper conversation just to give a little bit of sense of why each of us is here. So you want to start, Franz?
Well, what it drives me personally is that it stares you in the face that society has a huge problem, right, with ever-rising healthcare costs. You know all of this. So that drives me personally. Now, of course, what do you do with that motivation? Right? And being in the privileged position of being able to lead Philips, we have taken the health continuum and the health journeys, as well as the quadruple aim, basically as an innovation filter. We said everything we innovate needs to deliver on improving the continuum journey for the patient, and then measure it on the quadruple aim. Now, if you think that through, it's very profound, because medtech industry has always been innovating in the silos rather than in a horizontal way, right? And to get to value-based care and better outcomes for patients at less waste, you need to innovate horizontally. So we have taken our own Kool-Aid and started to build, for example, platforms for oncology, cardiac care, intensive care, where you focus on measuring the outcome, but also bringing in all the data that are relevant to the particular case. So in a way, you start living clinical decision support with a focus on driving outcomes and doing it as efficiently as possible. That has been quite a journey. You do meet all the issues around lack of interoperability and how do you get data out of the EMR, but we have proven that you can create this overlay to make value-based care insightful, although not on the population level, but on the interventional level. So if you think about practitioners in cardiac care or in oncology, you can actually follow the patient throughout the procedure and then compare notes. For that, of course, standards are important, and Philips has been a proponent of ICHOM, because we would love to just implement all these standard measurements in our clinical decision support informatics applications.
I'm going to come back to that, because there's a question in that I really like, which is, when is it really helping? When would we want it to drive my own clinical decision with that information loop? Like when would we want to trust that loop, that information, to say this is the thing that I want to make the decision on, rather than in the literature or the history or the things like that?
Yeah, but the data is only useful when you make it actionable, and we can measure and aggregate data until we see blue in the face. But we have a high market share in cardiac interventions, and we know that the standard of care, while being well-defined, varies wildly between practitioners. And between Leipzig Cardiac Center and somewhere here in the States, it could be a factor 2 or 3 different. Right? Now, how do you get everybody to the same best practice and outcomes? You would imagine that everybody wants that, right? But why doesn't it happen? You need to make it insightful, and somewhere there has to be eventually a carrot and a stick to drive this adoption. This is also why I'm such a proponent of data transparency, because I think transparency make people look in the mirror, right? And that will raise the standard of care for everybody.
So mirrors, Anish. Anish, let's go. Let's talk about your journey, because I think you've been all over this.
Yeah, so before I was in public service, I spent a decade at the advisory board company and looking at best practices to make the healthcare sector more effective. And I've long held the belief that if we could modernize the plumbing of the healthcare system, basically adopting a version of the healthcare internet, we could more easily identify what collection of activities result in better outcomes. And I've been maddeningly frustrated that we've not been able to shine as much transparency on where the variation is at the actionable level, and that if we could unlock that information, there should be an economic force that drives towards better results. And when I had the job as US CTO, to be US biased for a moment, we've been an overwhelmingly powerful actor on the economic stage for decades relative to our size in the global population. But as we look over the next 50 years, it's the healthcare tax that's basically going right after our innovation engine. And so there's a one-to-one relationship that our inability to get to that higher value outcome is costing us our children and grandchildren's economic strength. And so I was motivated. President Obama asked us to open up as much of this information as physically possible. And believe it or not, you can uncover a lot. In the Affordable Care Act, we said the release, the government was mandated to release Medicare data. That's our US program for the senior population and disabled. All of the information about every receipt collected on the performance of the Medicare program went from being secret, never to be shared, to public at the level that would allow anyone to research and identify what works and what doesn't. So Jamie, where I see I wish things happened faster, but where I see a decade after where this sort of legal framework has come into place, we are now globally moving towards a common data model in healthcare. We can add to that data model survey, assessment, outcome data, which I think is the heart and soul of what we're talking about at this conference. And if we combine that with some of the cost information, we should be able to understand, did I achieve my clinical objectives? And this doctor and hospital or cath lab combination is going to do a better job than others. And if we had an economic model, a total cost of care model, it would naturally create the forces to propel us. So I'm bullish we're going to get there. It took us a decade to get to a common health internet data model. But now, I think globally, we're seeing a lot more consensus around what that looks like, and you'll hear more about building on the foundation of FHIR APIs. So my hope is we're going to have the technology sector as a verb prepared for the next wave where business model and crisis and opportunity come together.
So what's it like doing this in the hospital?
Yeah, thanks. Yeah, so I think I bring a slightly different perspective, more from the provider side. I'm way not as technically knowledgeable as you guys are, but so at the Santion Hospital Group, it's 7 hospitals. What we do is we collect outcomes and costs across now 16 different medical conditions, and we use that data, the outcomes and cost data, to improve the care pathways for our patients. And I think your first question was, why do outcomes matter? Well, I think it is because the definition of outcomes is that it is what matters most to patients, right? So it's sort of a little bit of a circle there, but and I think if you zoom out, that is in the end what we should all be focused on, is improving those outcomes for our patients. And I think the approach that we take at Santion is really running an improvement cycle across our 7 hospitals, focused on collaborative learning, having our medical specialists and nurses and patients leading that journey. And in the end, I think it is about behavioral change, right? So I think it is, and I think Frans already alluded to that, but in the end, it is about data, but then it is about, gaining insights from the data and then actually achieving impact. And I think that last part, achieving impact, is about, really being able to adjust the care pathway and to adjust behaviors of our physicians and nurses. And I think we do it at 2 levels. We try to use the data in a benchmarking way to figure out how can we standardize the care pathways, because I think there's a lot of value in standardization. There's a lot of waste in the healthcare system, so by learning from the data, from the real world data, not just from research data, we can talk about that later, but actually in the real world, we try to optimize the care pathways, standardize them, but then the second part of it is personalize the care pathways. And for that, we're using the same outcome data to develop decision support tools. We support shared decision making between doctors and patients. We use predictive models, and sort of by using these kind of more technology-driven solutions, we really try to personalize the care pathway. So I think it's both about standardization and about personalization. And I think that's quite interesting, actually, because I don't think they're conflicting, but I think you have to do both.
So Mickey, I'm going to lay out the counter-optimism story in a second, and I want to come back and challenge you on it. But I know you've been passionate about this forever. So what brought you to sort of really believing we could change the system a little bit by measuring it?
Yeah, so I didn't realize I was on the hot seat, but I'm happy to be here. Bring it on. Yeah, I mean, I guess, I've sort of thinking about where I've gravitated, academically, I was always interested in areas of policy, science, technology, and economics, and sort of always found myself gravitating in those areas, both when I was in school, and then as I started working in the Defense Department, which has a lot of those same elements of bringing those things together, trying to figure out the science technology aspects of things, turning that into policy, thinking about the business drivers and the economics, all of it, and trying to put all that together, and getting complex issues resolved by bringing stakeholders together in areas where you need multiple, sort of stakeholders agreeing on something before you can move something forward. So healthcare is a perfect example in the US of where you need to be able to do that, right? The fragmentation of healthcare in the US, for those who aren't that familiar with the US healthcare system, I'll put system in quotes, is that it's unbelievably fragmented on the supply side and the demand side. And I would argue that if you looked at it from a policy perspective, from an economics perspective, that is kind of the root of almost every single issue we have in the healthcare sector in the US, is that fragmentation on the supply side and the demand side. And the reason that government sort of regulation and government orchestration of certain things is so important in the US, because it's very hard for the market to coordinate itself in the ways that it has been able to in almost every other sector in the US, certainly. It's very, very difficult for the market to coordinate itself in the US. So that's what struck me as being very interesting as I went through my career and sort of stumbled on health information technology. I was actually a manager at BCG and started working in Indianapolis on a case to build what eventually became the Indiana Health Information Exchange. And that seemed like a great opportunity to be able to bring together different stakeholders, payers, providers, employers, patients, to be able to start to forge these collaborations of thinking more collaboratively about how it is we're going to be able to get higher value and better performance out of our healthcare system.
So I'm going to go back to Stefan's slide of our Archimedes and the lever, and the patient outcomes are standing on it, and we're going to move the world. And to me, the strength of that lever is the technology platform in which we execute the patient experience or voice to change the system. And each of us, my work at Patients Like Me, which is a technological solution to bring outcomes to patients, but was never purchased by the health system in any way, only by drug companies. And then your work at Philips, where I think you've implemented some really significant successes, but it's still small compared to the scale of the business. Anish, you stood up essentially the whole information technology platform in the United States of America, and outcomes were not really part of it, right? We spent $40 billion, and we talked about that at the time, and it was hard and it was constrained. You're with $3.5 billion in revenue, and 0.01% of it's going into optimization of care by outcomes, which is not to say that's not remarkable, but it's still small, right? So if we go through this scenario, this lever, it's still orthogonal to the core part of healthcare. We've all talked about this a little bit, but how do we go from being something that we do because we want the world to be better, something we do because we all want to make care better, we want to make lives better, to something that we can get rewarded for doing continually better and becoming central in the system, making the lever strong?
But, Peter already referred to it, that this may not be a technology issue, but something else. Right? And I would say government has done a good job on standards and obliging EMR companies to open up their interfaces. So on paper, that's all there, right? But to dance, you need to have a desire to dance. and that desire is not always there. Then you talk about behavior, incentives. The whole systems change needs to happen before we see real impact. And for systems change, I do think there is a role for the payers, a role for the governments, but also for the C-suites of the providers to say, we want to go there, right? And it may affect the business model. But that's for a good thing to keep this all in a sustainable way. I think the first intervention that needs to happen is transparency on outcomes. And it's good that you give stars to doctors, but you know, the more precise outcomes we can publish, the better it is. And even if, then I can see that people would say the argument, well, the standards are not defined yet. Yes, that's why we're here at ICHOM for. But I would advocate not to wait. Make it obligatory to start publishing your high frequency interventions. And maybe there will be 2 different ways to do it, but at least we start to get transparency. And I think that will be a sea change in the adoption of the technology that basically is already there. We can solve all these things from a technology point of view and it can go quick enough.
Maybe I'll just be US-centric in the response if we're going to kind of do the ping pong back and forth. I'm looking at Franco Pelka here in the front, whom I love dearly, and I want to suggest to you a path. What we have right now is a very top-down set of projects. There's a data interoperability project. There's a how do we move the United States payment system towards more value orientation process. There's a competition policy to make sure the fragmentation, when it consolidates, doesn't work against the American people sort of legal framework. The power of the US model of standardization is it requires evidence of industry adoption. Early adopters can come together. And so Frank and I are working on a project to take the headline of this title. Part of what motivated me to join today, Jamie, was that we want to move towards patient-centered. Well, we had a big political fight in the United States that was resolved about 2 years ago called surprise billing. Forget paying for outcomes. How about just showing up at the hospital and not knowing that the anesthesiologist that's injecting you with pain medication is not in the network, and so your fees just went up by 5x because no one told you that the network contracts weren't designed in such a way. So as a response to that, Congress basically told the private sector, you need to develop the framework for what a consumer would believe a good faith estimate should be to include a series of activities. But Frans, no one has defined the good faith estimate for a cardiac procedure that you're describing. One argument is, okay, let's go to the 3 silos. Let's go to the interoperability people and say, I want this data element to be standardized, and you can do that. We could go to the payment reform people and say, hey, you should demand this if you want to get paid. We could do that. We could go to the anti-competitive people and say, hey, this has got to be a factor in determining whether this is delivering a competitive market. Or, Frank and I have said, what if we just define what a good faith estimate is for a particular procedure? So we just started today with 10. We picked breast biopsy and some other things and said, okay, normally this is a simple line item in the curve, but it co-occurs with half a dozen other things. You got to run pathology, you got to do this, that, and the other. So we said, let's define a bundle of activity in an open source framework. And now we have the foundation of what the inputs are to the good faith estimate. That's the start. And then we work on what are the clinical outcomes you would like to see on account of it. So when you shop for good faith estimate, you deserve an estimate price and some transparency on quality. We can work on that together. I don't need him to issue a new law. I don't need Congress to change the law that's already on the books. I need half a dozen organizations to work together to agree that that should be the good faith estimate when the consumer demands it when they walk into our institution. So now that you're retired, Frans, why don't we get you to work on Project Clarity and we can move it 10x the speed. But the point is, Jamie, we need an organizing coalition of the willing to move the ball down the field. And it doesn't require 1 million of us to coordinate. It requires a half a dozen, maybe 8, 10, to show the evidence of industry adoption. And then the regulators can scale it.
There's something really critical in what you're saying.
Yes, often whatever I say is critical.
No, he said there's only one thing. I want to hear what it is.
Do you remember what it is? No, I think having spent an immense amount of time working with consumers, this idea that there's a unit of understanding is really, really important, because you can break healthcare apart in so many ways. You can digest the data. You can look at it as, a drug or an intervention or a day or but the whole idea, I did something around something, that unit, is really critical. And I think that not sufficiently understood as something we need to do, and it sort of relates to the outcome itself. It relates to the value side, the cost side of it. But I also don't agree that you can just get together and agree. And I think that we have to do something, and this is going to come back to Mickey, we have to figure out, we are moving too slowly with insufficient pull towards the ability to actually measure and make rational decision making, because there's so much resistance to it, so much silo, so much value in remaining secret in some ways. So I think we need to do something. I mean, even between your hospital talking about if we could say we're going to change the economic architecture of the hospital reward system, who gets the the nicer surgical suites and all that stuff around who's performing, that would change the system. And so I think we need more pull to make this happen in some way. But I love the idea of agreeing, and I think that's really critical.
Yeah, well, I mean, in the U.S., Anish always likes to use the term demand signal, right? How do you have sort of the concentrated demand signal? And in the U.S., again, I'm going to go back to this fragmentation issue. If you're a provider anywhere, whether you're an ambulatory provider or a hospital in the U.S., you are working with multiple health payers, and each of them has their own set of quality measures. There's some overlap in them, but 20 years prior to joining the federal government, I worked in the clinical quality space and built businesses aggregating clinical and claims data and then calculating measures. And one of the biggest challenges was that every hospital is working with 15 different payers, whatever it is, and each of them has different measure requirements. Each of them has different measure specifications. I mean, we're here talking about global consensus on this. We can't, in the US, we don't have consensus among the payers themselves. Medicare and Medicaid tend to drive a lot because they're present in every single market in the US, but they're still only just a slice of it. So people tend to gravitate a little bit toward those, but I think, as all of you know, in measure development, being sort of similar is just as good as being completely dissimilar, right? Because it's a different measure calculation, it's different data elements, and that's where we start to see the breakdown of that sort of single consensus. And as Franz is saying, well, why don't we all just publish what our outcomes are? It's like, oh great, we've been spending 25 years arguing over what are outcomes, even in sort of the simplest ways, to be able to drive payment models that get people to care about it. Whether it's patients or providers. I think that's the biggest challenge. So, what we're doing is doing everything we can to make data available. And this is where you get a little bit into the supply-demand, the supply-side, demand-side things, is that with ONC, the National Coordinator's Office that I run, we're more the supply side. So we can work on requiring through our certification processes and other authorities that we have, the availability of data to other authorized parties. What we can't do, and technology that has certain features about openness and open architectures and sort of support for standards and interoperability and things like that. What we can't do is tell the doctors you have to use these technologies.
But Mickey,
that's a little bit of the challenge.
You could say that ICHOM is actually an industry result, right? Multiple parties, public-private, right, came together, formed ICHOM, worked 10 years of it. So what would stop the government to actually say, everybody use the ICHOM standard and get going?
US law, right? I mean, these are all things that are baked in regulation. And so, when you say the US government, what do you actually mean by that? The US government doesn't right now have the authority to say, tomorrow we are going to require every one of you use whatever ICHOM set of measures are required to be reported, right? There's no such authority that exists in the US government. I mean, you know, for the US government, compared to many other countries, especially industrialized European countries, has a very weak federal government compared to other countries. And so, you know, we don't have those kinds of
I can say
authorities.
the Dutch government is not better.
Well, in the U.S., you know, so one way that gets driven in the U.S. is through Medicare and Medicaid, right? Now they have huge activities working on quality measures. It's very much a public process where organizations provide feedback. They work with NCQA, they work with NQF, and it's a complex collaborative process where they take those inputs and then they come to a set of consensus measures and move all that forward.
Peter, how does this affect your reimbursement when you, on your own, if you took Mickey's language of being fragmented and said, our group of 7 is pursuing this transparency by ourselves, what does that mean operationally? Do you negotiate better rates? Is it even Steven, it doesn't matter, you're doing the right thing? What does it mean as a solo actor moving forward on transparency?
Yeah, I mean, that's actually challenging. So what we do is, I think the majority of the success that we've achieved is based on intrinsic motivation of our professionals. So we really try to, you know, have them sort of engage in this way of working because of, you know, from their intrinsic motivation of becoming a medical professional. And I think that is actually a very strong driver of change. On top of that, we are negotiating with the health plans in the Netherlands to see whether we can, you know, introduce more value-based reimbursement contracts, etc. But that part goes very, very slowly in our country. And I know there's other countries, including the US, where you actually make much more progress in this field. So there we can learn a lot from what happens. And the same on the procurement side, sort of with the suppliers. We also try to introduce more of those outcome indicators in the way that we negotiate those contracts. But also that is still something where there's a lot of work to do, I think, to be done to figure out what the best contracts are.
In my view, the reason that is because there's a lot of top-down desire. It's a lot easier to say, let's have a common procurement framework, we'll reward this, you'll plug right in, your results will demonstrate, and you win. But you're doing it by yourself, one by one, it's a little bit more difficult. However, we're in a bit of a sea change in the US. I would argue the most impactful part of the Affordable Care Act over the long run was the legal structure we put in place for the Medicare and Medicaid Innovation Center. In other words, we created an authority that, to kind of Mickey's point, you're not going to have a new law that's going to just sort of say, ICHOM everywhere. I mean, you could propose it in Congress. I don't think it's going to go anywhere. However, this center has the legal authority to test, validate, and scale what works. So let me just give you a little example. One of the publicly traded companies, I have the pleasure of working with them, called ICHOM. They're a private equity, they were private equity backed, now publicly traded, primary care network risk management company. And so in Akron, Ohio, they recruited about 20% of the doctors in the city and said, let's work together and figure out, among other things, what constitutes great outcomes in cardiac care. I'm mentioning it because you mentioned cardiology. So they developed a framework. Maybe they borrowed from ICHOM, and candidly, they kind of built their own little math. But in theory, one could test an ICHOM instrument in the Agilon model. And they were able to not only identify the best performing cardiologists, but they were successful in encouraging patients to go there when they weren't obligated to. There's no managed care. This is open Medicare. And they saved something on the order of $2,000 per patient on account of better outcomes, lower cost, because they were able to identify and nudge patients towards the best specialists. Now, did that require a new law? No. They participated in a model that is testing whether or not primary care doctors can be an arbiter, a quarterback, an advisor, I call it a health information fiduciary, to guide beneficiaries without taking away their choice. And if a dozen of those organizations said, let's test the ICHOM standard for X, nothing stops them.
So a coalition of the willing.
That's my point.
Okay.
So part of the reason why you come to a conversation like this is that some of you want top-down change, because you know what? It's just easier if there was a sentence at the State of the Union for President Biden to say, I shall have outcomes-based reimbursement and it'll look like X in 12 months. To Mickey's point, that's not realistic. But
Could the doctors in Akron team up with doctors at Stan's organization at Intermountain in Utah? Could team up with doctors in Albany, New York? It doesn't take but half a dozen, maybe 8 to 10 of those communities to say, you know what, this is what I want to work on. And for transparency's sake, we struggle. You tell me, Mickey, how many of the specialty society registries are willing to open up the provider performance data? That is like locked in secret society stuff. But the Cures Act, the foundation of the new round of regulation that Mickey is operationalizing, which is to open up more data in a modern API-based manner, the Cures Act 2.0 draft legislation that's up for renewal explicitly calls for clinical registries attached to the Medicare claims data. So we have one more round of public disclosure. But it, again, is a hollow words on a page. It needs communities of coalitions to say, let's do it this way, not that way, which is why you need Frank Opelka in the room.
So David Lansky was talking about the fact that we should not assume that this becomes exponential, that there are forces that push back against integration, and there's a lot of money to be made in monopolistic silos in healthcare, maintaining them, right? So I love a lot of this conversation. I'll just sort of summarize it in one way, which is there's a lot of new liquidity, technology layers, new data layers that are becoming available, and all of us technologists are better at connecting them and integrating them, even if they're not quite the same. That's happening. And I think I agree with you. It's certainly in the U.S. The experiment of the programs that you're running to sort of run competitive experiments is really effective. I don't know if there's an example in Europe or other countries that are the same, but like the idea that you can just make bets and sort of deliver value. But I still want to feel, it feels like we should be looking for some really good early examples. You talked about this, like smaller cases, maybe it's in cardiac care, where we can really say, we've got an economic loop, we've got a technology loop that's improving, we've got an outcome loop that's improving, and we've got engagement on the providers and the patient side that's improving, where it starts to really begin to snowball. Because I think we've had lots and lots of great examples of things that make a very big difference in local context, but we have not had, or don't have examples yet of something that becomes self-reinforcing and growing in its versioning.
So, but I think what I hear everybody also say is that transparency, and that was what Franz started about, right? That transparency is really important. That's going to be a driver, right? If you would be more transparent about the outcomes delivered, and you need a standard way, right? And that's what ICHOM does. I mean, that's the work for the last 10 years. But I think, and I'm curious about how would that enable sort of technology, because that's what this session is about, obviously, but sort of, technology-enabled improvement or innovation. How would that be accelerated by more transparency and outcomes? That's a question that I would be wondering about. For
there's a specific example. I
think it would, but
yeah, there's a company called Hope Bridge that worked on the autism outcome standard set. They brought a coalition of enterprises together with ICHOM, and the CNO and I were talking in the last couple of weeks, and he's implemented this internally. He's got 2 million hours of therapy. He's got an analyst working on it, and he's sort of asking me the question, like, "This is great. I'm the leader in the space. I've got 6,000 clinicians. I'm doing this. How does it help my business perform?" And it's a real question. Like sort of like they made the investment, they're implementing it, and I think that goes to what you're talking about. Like, how do we create rewards for enterprises that lead in that context? And we don't have. I don't think we have a system. In fact, I think we have a system that may even punish them a little bit, because you create liability, you create transparency that's unique to you, and your competitors are hiding it.
Well, but let's take that one example and ask Mickey, not to put you on the spot because you don't remember all the detail of every ICHOM standard, but let's just take for the sake of argument what I'll share, which is we have a regulation on the books that goes live 12/31, no later than, where doctors and hospitals are going to have their EHR vendors supply them the Cures Act version of their electronic health record. You might want to say a word about that. But yesterday, by the way, CMS finalized the rule. Doctors have to turn on the Cures Act version
no later than September of next year. The question, Mickey, for you would be how technology is creating a paradigm shift. How might a doctor with a Cures Act EHR publish the data that could be informing an ICHOM measure? And maybe you could share a word about what that would look like in the form of maybe a bulk fire application or something to that effect. How would one take the information in their EHR now that you've upgraded it in order to make it easier to compute a quality measure? Mm-hmm.
Yeah, so I think that, I mean, there are a couple of different layers here to what we can, kind of think of as, generally, I guess, the 21st Century Cures Act architecture. There's data, and then there are the various ways to mobilize or make available that data. And we're, working on APIs, as Anish is talking about, and then nationwide network interoperability. So let me just start, quickly with the data itself. So ONC requires that all those EHR vendors that are now in 97% of hospitals use a certified electronic health record that's certified by my office, and 90% of ambulatory providers across the country. So that's an amazing sort of floor of capability now that exists across the country. So I'm going to disagree on a point that Jamie says that $40 billion actually was down the tubes. I would slightly refine what he said to say that that was actually a remarkable success, that entire program. Slight difference of opinion. But the US CDI, the US Core Data for Interoperability, is a standard that we require be supported by EHR vendors. And what that's done in the market is that has become kind of the minimum data set of the US healthcare delivery system. Everything from CMS interoperability rules that require payers make information available to members, to what providers are required to make available to any other authorized party, to what the Apple Health Record supports. If you look at the Apple Health Record, that's based on the US CDI. Why did they do that? Not because we regulate them, we don't, but because they see that that's the only scalable way that they can run that business across the country, is to follow fast on the heels of what the US regulations require across the entire market. So the data is the first, and then the APIs that Anish is talking about is the 21st Century Cures Act, and the rule that we promulgated requires that by the end of this calendar year, every certified EHR vendor, which covers all those numbers I just talked about, is required to make available a standard API that supports the availability of that US Core Data for Interoperability for any authorized party. So for an individual to be able to access their own information, but for a payer, for example, to be able to get that information. One of the challenges that we have with that, and this is an ongoing conversation we have with the quality community and with my great colleagues at Medicare and Medicaid, is that the more and more, and I haven't looked at the ICHOM data set, but if you look at the ICHOM measures, for example, and if we map those and said, well, what sort of subset or what percent of those measures would be supported by the data elements of the US CDI, I think you'd find it is a very small percent, if any, actually, because just from my experience in working quality measures, you start to say, well, all right, it's just hypertension. But then you get into the inclusion criteria, the exclusion criteria, the look-back periods. All of those things are, start to become more and more esoteric data elements that are in different parts of the EHR. And then you start to get into that kind of complexity, which brings us all to a standstill. So one of the things that we've been working with, with our colleagues at CMS to think about is there a less is more strategy? To say, what if I'm able to get more consistent data along, across all of the different settings, according to that, sort of the minimum data set, and then try to base the ways that I measure performance, not just in sort of the old style numerator denominator, but start to think about algorithms and start to think about other more novel ways of being able to, measure performance. How would that compare to the path that I'm on now, where I try to do increasingly narrow, specific measures that are based on more and more esoteric data elements that has all sorts of holes in it, because I'm not going to get that uniformity across the entire sort of set of that foundation of data source systems. I think that's one of the challenges that we face.
I think that would really help, Mickey, because if you try to solve world hunger, then it is really hard. Whereas if we can make it smaller, we should be able to go faster. And I do think the professional associations should be able to help us with that. Right, to say what subset of an outcome measure can we actually deliver on relatively quickly. And I would certainly advocate that the professional organizations take a lead role, because we heard from Peter Debye that actually, you need to act on the data, and those are the same professionals. So if we get the professionals to move, that will be a big win. But there needs to be a nudge. right? And that nudges, I think, a societal expectation, and if it can't be done by laws, then at least we should remind ourselves that this should be an expectation, is that that providers are transparent about the quality and the outcomes that they deliver. Right? Now, if that is the first mantra, and then the professional organizations say, okay, on cardiac care or on AFib ablations, here is our success rate, right? In a minimized standard, I think we could go much faster.
Can I ask a question, Frans? Could you require the same from technological companies or from pharma companies to be transparent about the outcomes they deliver for the solutions that you bring into the market?
Oh, absolutely. I think this needs to be team sport. But earlier in the conversation, we actually concluded that from a technological side, a lot is now possible. Right? The standards are there. A lot of the data can be aggregated. And there are enough technology companies like Philips prepared to deliver this.
No, but I mean, that could be a real driver as well, right? If you would require new solutions that come into the market to really prove in the real world that it actually adds, patient value.
So this is a perfect segue, because I think, Mickey, my criticism of the EHR strategy, it was not that it did not build the infrastructure to manage the transactions of medicine in the United States. It did, and you built that, and it's remarkable. But my background is actually development, clinical development. I have to prove something works, and I think what you just talked about proving in the real world that these, one of the things I think about, I've never found an example of a pharma company or someone running a clinical trial using data from an EHR. You always have to do something to upgrade it to make it clinically interpretable. And so I think, to me, there are two paths here. We have transparency increasingly about what medicine does, but we do not have transparency or measures for how medicine affects people. And some of it is in the EHR, like obviously in diabetes and some things that are lab-based, but generally, whether the person got better in their expression or experience is not present. So I guess in the last minutes here, to me, the dream, and I think it's time about is when can we get to a place in some part of medicine, how do we get to a place where where I would want to make a decision for someone I love based on data collected in the real world on who, what, where, when, how I should change my outcome that would be as good or better than the best clinical research, and then that would be used to change how we pay for and do that. Because that's where I think we're trying to get to. And I think we do need to know what we do, which is what the EMRs do, but we have to know what it does. And I think that's not baked in, and in fact is still architecturally not really part of the system. We don't have, the way we do development, we invent systems to measure outcomes that we don't use in care, and they should be integrated. So,
well, I mean, if Stefan's in the room, if you heard Mickey, he just gave us the clue. CMS and ONC are brokering a conversation about how to think about next generation quality that can be run computationally on the open regulated data set. I'm not putting words in his mouth, but I'm interpreting a language that he described. Just this week, Liz Fowler, who runs the Medicare Innovation Center, publicly stated that her next round of experiments will include, what is it? Patient-reported outcomes. So, the moment is now, as I read the news in the last 5 days, that if there's an industry interest, if ICHOM would to take to the Medicare Innovation Center a recommended set of patient-reported outcomes measures that could align with her roadmap, they're already working with Mickey, so we have a pathway to get moving bottom up, not waiting for any new vehicle. That, to me, it's not going to happen by itself. Poor Liz is going to rely on whatever committees give her some recommendations on what quote-unquote patient-reported outcomes are. Or we have our internationally proven frameworks and elements, and we bring them quickly, expeditiously to her. We get a godfather like Stan Huff involved to make sure that these are clinically valid, and we have a mechanism to bring this community in to problem solve for what the policymakers have just said in the US. We're ready to make that move. So my view is take the mantle, the invitation, and engage and make that, I would say that's the next 90 days effort as I read the policy tea leaves.
before we started this meeting, you were strong on saying public-private partnership.
Yes.
Right? He said France, public-private partnership.
This is the opportunity.
This is
I'm
it, right?
describing.
Yes. So we are optimistic.
Well,
But ask Mickey if he would like it. Mickey,
No,
would you
I
like
mean, like,
collaborators? Before we get excited, Mickey, do you like this?
Yeah, Mickey, are you ready? Can we come to you and say, let's build it in the real world, something that measures whether we can do it?
Sorry?
But let's build something in the real world where we add to what we do and we measure what it does. And can we build something that makes money and makes people better?
Yeah, I mean, I think, Anish was, headed in that direction, which is to say that, it's got to be, either people, they feel intrinsically motivated to it because they feel it's going to offer their organization value, right? So Mayo Clinic believes that this is going to offer us value to do this in this standardized way. Right? That doesn't happen because of fragmentation, all of those things, right? Mayo Clinic practices very different than Mass General, and even within Mayo Clinic, they practice very, very differently, right? So we don't even have that kind of standardization that we're talking about among the users themselves. Or people are required to do it by law, and we've talked a little bit about the challenges of doing that. There's some things we can do, there's some things we can't do, or it's through the payment mechanism. And in the US, Medicare and everything under CMS, which is Medicare, Medicaid, the innovation models are sort of the most uniform driver of that value equation across the country. Otherwise, you've got to get together Anthem and United Healthcare and all these fragmented players who are big nationally but small in lots of different markets and don't have that kind of sort of impact. So I think that's really the place to go for us to have this conversation. So
I'll end and I'll say we started before we were talking about being a cynical optimist, and you asked me if I was an optimistic cynic. I think what's neat about having been here 10 years ago at the beginning of this today is to talk about a business like Philips actually running a full cycle loop in cardiac care, to talk about what you're talking about, the fact that there's things coming online and we have an infrastructure now that is capable of at least taking what we do and what's coming next. The fact that you're running it in your hospitals, things that we imagined weren't even possible 10 years ago, it's nice to think about what could be possible 10 years from now. Maybe we can go a little faster. So thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
All right.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.